Shadowrun, D&D, and more with D4 on the floor.
Welcome to dicegeeks.com tabletop RPG show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is dicegeeks.com tabletop RPG show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. Okay, guys, I have another awesome interview coming right up. But first, if you would support the podcast in some way, I would greatly appreciate it. Please like, rate, review, or subscribe wherever you are listening right now. Those things help the channel immensely. Also, if you have the means and could support the show financially, that would be incredible. You can do so over at patreon.com/dicegeeks. Also, I am putting out GM resource books all the time. If you want to check those out, they are on dicegeeks.com. They're on amazon.com as well as drivethrurpg.com. Just search for Dice Geeks, Book of Random Tables, something like that. You will find them. All right, here's today's interview. My guest today is a podcaster and dungeon master, Mark at 4D on the Floor. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
When did you first start throwing dice?
It would have been 1989. I was about 16, and my first game was actually Shadowrun. A friend of mine had picked up the book at in the mall where I was working, and a couple of them were talking about it, and they wanted another player, and they said, "Let's go ask Mark." And I'd always been interested in when I was a kid. With people playing Dungeons and Dragons and things like that, but I just had never had the opportunity to learn about what that really meant. And so I said, "Yeah, well, I'll try this out." And Shadowrun is still one of my favorites. It's just it's what I cut my teeth on, and I've spent a lot of time specifically as a game master for Shadowrun, but I love the opportunity to play too.
Okay, that's awesome. Sadly, I have never gotten to play. Me and a buddy poured over, I think it was the 3rd edition book for like a month, and then I was like, I can't figure it out. Let's play something else.
Sure. Yeah, it's definitely a complicated system compared to some. 3rd edition is my favorite, by the way.
Oh, that's awesome. That is awesome. What did you like about Shadowrun?
Well, the world is a lot of fun. This whole mix of sort of, this punk cyberware and the fact that you get the magic as well. And there's orcs and trolls and dwarves and elves, and you get that fantasy aspect, but then you get to, play around in the streets of Seattle and blow things up and, all this sort of action hero stuff. I also really like the D6 system. I like the posturing that goes along. That's kind of the word I always use. I don't know if that's correct, but I like that in Shadowrun I can make a lot of decisions on how defensive or offensive I want to be. And I don't feel like that's always as clear in a lot of other games. It's a little simpler where you just kind of, roll your D20 or whatever it is. But in Shadowrun you have, dice pools that you work with, and you're able to sort of throw extra dice at things, and rolling extra dice is always fun.
Yeah, I agree. Anytime I get to roll more dice, it's awesome. Yeah, and I've always loved the Shadowrun world as well. I mean, that's it's just such an awesome mix. So I am grieved that I have never gotten to actually play. Maybe I'll change that here in the future. But the world is always just been really fascinating. Just kind of that, like you were saying, like the cyberware plus the magic plus elves and dwarves that are hacking and things like that. It was just just always a cool world. And of course, I don't know if you remember, but they actually had an old video game on the Sega Genesis. I don't know if you remember
yes,
that.
I knew it well.
Yeah. I played that quite a bit, and that's taken me way back now. But that was a lot of fun. It probably looked a little outdated by today's standards, I'm sure, but I remember it being a lot of fun.
Yeah, I've got it in a closet somewhere. I might have to dig it out after this.
Well, there you go. I'm bringing back some old memories. But I just remember it because it was just fun. It was like one of those first games where you could do cyber mods on yourself and everything like that on your character. It was just really, really cool.
Yeah, back in the Sega Genesis days, it was pretty elaborate.
Yes. Yeah. And then they had a whole hacking cyberspace kind of mode where you'd go in and download somebody's credits or something, wasn't it? I think.
Yeah. Pay data, whatever it was.
Yeah. So that's just really interesting. But I always find it interesting too when I learn what game people played first. Of course, I think usually I find it's Dungeons and Dragons, but every once in a while when somebody else says a different game, that's I find that really interesting. So I assume though you did not just stick to playing Shadowrun.
Right. Yeah, I've played a little bit of everything. I mean, Shadowrun's always kind of the one that we go back to, but I played when it comes to like D&D, my first experience with D&D would have been, not that long after that, with second edition AD&D and THACO and all that. And then I've played every edition since. The thing that I really like about D&D, it's kind of almost like the opposite of what I like about Shadowrun, because I like the lore of Shadowrun. I sort of I'm very steeped in what the game designers have built, the world that they built over the course of decades now, I guess. And in D&D they have all of that as well, and it's great, and it's always an interest. But my experience with D&D and fantasy games is that it's a little bit more, at least in my experience, it's usually somebody's world that they've created, and they've put together, all of the lore and the background and the history, and that's it's like a whole different sort of type of exploration, I guess, as you get to play.
I always like to ask too, just what was it about? What do you think it is about role-playing games that just kind of captured your imagination?
Well, I think capturing your imagination is a good way to put it. It allows you to sort of have these adventures that you get to share with people, for one thing, right? I have friends that we laugh about something goofy that happened, and I'm sure everybody that plays has the same stories, right? Like this weird thing where the die roll made something crazy happen, or even if a character died or something sort of ridiculous happened, and it's almost like you get to experience it like it's a memory. It's like something that happened to us around the table. And frankly, some of my best friends are gamers, because I don't think that you can spend a lot of time around a table playing these games without connecting with people. When that happens, it's short-lived, but those people that you play with for a long time, it's easy to close to people through these games.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think, just some of my best friends are gamers and that we've played together, now for decades and that. And so I absolutely agree. And like what you said there, it's like, it's something that like happened, it's something that it's a memory. It creates a memory that's like, it's something happened between friends and those stories that we tell each other, right? I mean, that we tell together at the table just kind of stay with us. And of course, I could send a text or a Facebook message right now to some people and just say like one or two words, and they would just like, die laughing and send me like 3 paragraphs of how they remember
Sure.
that one session that happened, 20 years ago or whatever it was. And yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. But now, did you start? You said you really started running Shadowrun, so I assume you didn't stay a player long and started game mastering pretty quickly then?
Yeah, pretty quickly. I think that the friend that was GMing, we were in late high school by that point, and I think that college sort of split us up a little bit. I mean, we're still close friends today. He was the best man at my wedding, and we see each other a couple times a year. But when we all sort of split up, weren't in the same city anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, well, if you're going to play, Mark, you're gonna have to run the game, find some people to play with you, and so that's what I did.
Yeah. And so then did you run Shadowrun for like another group, or is that when you kind of branched into D&D?
Yeah, I ran Shadowrun. Really, for the longest time, that was kind of what I ran. I would play lots of different things, like D&D throughout all those different editions. I was always a player, but when it came to Shadowrun, I was the guy running the game.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe let's talk some game master advice then. What are maybe, like, just to kind of start off, what was maybe something like the biggest thing that you learned when you from so many years of running Shadowrun?
I think that, like we talked about, the idea that it's very visual. I think that it became very clear to me, even as a young person, that description was really important. Being able to describe the different, how things smell, or the textures on things, or the colors. It added a lot to the experience, not just for my players, but also for me, right? So we could all really see it together. And thankfully, my first GM was very much like that. He was the kind of guy that would spin around when he got shot by somebody in the game, and sort of hit the wall and slide down, and we'd all imagine the gore on the wall. And so I sort of took that from him, I think, as I went. But it's interesting because Shadowrun, because of the fact that it's got this lore that I'm pretty read up on. It meant, I think, in a lot of ways, that I didn't have to prep as much for some other games, because I just used the knowledge of what I knew, right? So, like the different corporations, for instance, who's in charge and who owns what part of the city that we're in, and things just sort of naturally happen as far as the storytelling goes. When I started DMing Dungeons and Dragons, in which I was creating my own world for really the first time, where I did that for our podcast. It created a lot more prep, because I had to really like dig in and figure out what's going on in this world. How did this all get here? Which gods created this, and what happened to those gods, and what factions are here. But either way, it was always a labor of love, no matter how we were working through the game. And I think that what's funny is I have just as much fun prepping, I think, for the game. Sometimes I like to just sit down and write things, and I'm sure I'm not alone, because it's fun to put down an idea, and then later on, somehow that idea can come up in a future session. I have like lists of NPCs, and I have lists of different taverns that I want to go to someday, or any of that kind of stuff. And I keep documents on my computer where I can just really quickly grab something, whether it's before the game or whether it's during the game, and just constantly looking out for things. Constantly, people say, they'll say, "Oh, that's a great album name," right?
Mm-hmm.
And when they hear something interesting, and I do the same thing with taverns, like, ooh, we're calling a tavern that, and set it aside and then find it later.
Yeah. Nice. Nice. So that's really interesting. And I would tend to agree that once you start diving in and start creating your own world, things can get out of hand pretty quickly. Because worlds are complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah, absolutely. Before it's just a couple random things before we leave Shadowrun, and I'm definitely going to ask you about your podcast and the world you created there, because I'm definitely interested. Before we leave Shadowrun a little bit, have you seen I think it was from 1991, the video clip? They did like a commercial.
Oh, I have, yeah, with the skipping.
Yeah, like the side running, sideways running,
side skipping, muscle guy.
Yeah,
yes,
yeah. That was when I can't remember when I saw it. It seems like I saw it like years ago, and then I saw it pop up on Reddit sometime a while back, and I was like, oh my gosh! If I would have seen that in 1991, I would have lost my mind. That would have been the coolest stuff.
Yeah, if people haven't seen that, they just need to YouTube it. It's just it's all kinds of awesome and it's bad in a good way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's very surreal. Yes, it's like an 80s take on fantasy future, with like maybe $100 budget.
Yeah, horrible effects. And I think that they played that originally at Gen Con.
Okay.
I remembered a friend of mine had gone to it back in the 90s and come back and told me about it. And then, we found it on YouTube years later. We're like, oh, I forgot that existed.
Yeah. So maybe I'll drop it in the show notes if I remember, because it is awesome. It is. That's the only way you can describe it.
I'm absolutely going to go watch that when we get done.
Oh gosh. Yeah, I may too, but it is a lot of fun. And you just can't look away from it. It's one of those things where it is. Yeah, it's so bad, but it's awesome. But anyway, then also what was it? Didn't John Ford, wasn't the novelist John Ford, didn't he write a lot of Shadowrun stuff? I don't know.
I don't know. I know that I think the guy's name was William Gibson, who they took a lot of his stuff from. There was a gosh, I'm not going to remember the name of the. There were a series of books that kind of really invented the Matrix.
The Neuromancer.
Yes, Neuromancer. Thanks.
Yeah, I was just trying to remember. I thought I remember seeing. I think it's John M. Ford who wrote some Shadowrun stuff. He wrote some material for the Star Trek FASA game.
Oh, okay.
And then he wrote a Star Trek novel called Final Reflection. And I think he may have written some material for the game and a novel or two from.
Gotcha. There's a lot of novels back then. I've got quite a few hiding in my back room here, but I don't recognize the name.
Yeah. Okay. Well, not to get too far afield, but I just thought I remember that. But so to ask you now to kind of transition into your podcast, you mentioned like this, creating this world and that. So why don't you tell us like the name of your podcast, and then you really started creating your own world for 5th edition D&D rules, right?
Right. Yeah. And it was really my first big foray into it. But believe it or not, because I've been playing for years and running specifically Shadowrun, and I'd never really taken the step into just creating my own fantasy world. But for years I had just collected ideas, like, hey, if I was going to run a fantasy game, I would totally do this. My world would have this, that sort of thing. And so I got to, after pushed 30 years of playing at that point. I just sort of unleashed all that stuff, and said, okay, I'm just gonna throw all this stuff into this world. And I wrote up a little spiel, which actually, so our podcast is called D4 on the Floor. We have a little logo that we're very happy about. My brother is one of the players, and he does a lot of the artwork for different episodes and things, so that the little thumbnails when you find it on Spotify or wherever.
Mm-hmm.
And we had talked about doing a D&D campaign. We were just finishing up a Shadowrun campaign as a group, and I wrote up this little intro to talk about the world, and it's called the prologue. It's still sitting there. It's the first thing I think we published on for the podcast. But I just wrote it up and I sent it to all of them, and I said, hey, I'm thinking about doing this campaign. What do you guys think? And everybody was like, I'm in. They just got excited, and I fed off of that excitement. And then I think it was Lance specifically, one of the players, that was like, what do you think? What do you guys think about doing a podcast? And again, everybody kind of got excited and said, yeah, let's try it out. And so we started we started playing in June of 2018 with this campaign of 2018. And we started publishing episodes, I think, that December. So we kind of piled up a few episodes to try to get ahead of it, so that it wasn't something that we were feeling, the crunch of the deadline, because we released every 2 weeks. And then 57 episodes later, we finished in June, this past June of 2021. And so we're kind of in the middle of trying to figure out what our next step would be. It was a lot of fun, and it was a big learning experience. But yeah, as I went through the entire process, I just, and obviously my players added more and more to the world with me, but I just added more and more to the background of what was happening, and thought about different parts of the world. I mean, it was a lot of fun. It was just constant creation for a good 3 years. And I'm still adding to it a little bit, just sort of for my own fun and for future use.
Sure, absolutely. I guess what would since you started creating this huge world, and your players have obviously would be adding to it, and you're doing, what was maybe kind of some of your first steps? What were some of the first things that you started doing that may help somebody else out if they're going to start creating their world?
So, my first step was to kind of come up with an overarching theme, in a sense. Whether I wanted it to be, I decided that I wanted it to be kind of high fantasy. Mm-hmm. And I wanted a campaign that I would describe as kind of a heroic campaign. In Shadowrun, your characters often don't know what's going on behind the scenes. So they in Shadowrun, they play, effectively, they're criminals, and they're working for these corporations, and they irritate the corporations, and the corporations, send people out after them or to work against them. But the players don't always know that stuff. It's just part of the game. In this game, in this D&D campaign, I wanted it to be a world-changing game in which, when we got done with the campaign, they were going to have changed the world. They were going to have done these epic, heroic things that were going to make a big difference. And so it was really a change in perspective and mindset. And so I started with this idea of just setting up this conflict in the world, and I set it up between two religious factions, and that's really where it starts. And so the part of the world that they are in, there's a kind of an established church that runs the place, and then there's sort of a faction that's, you know, sort of related, broken off, or you know, however you describe it, that is kind of on the other side of the kingdom, or you know, the at least the part of the world that we're in. And so I started with that concept, but then what I did as far as world building, and I think that this was really helpful, was I just started thinking about where do they get their stuff. And I know that sounds kind of boring, but when you start off and you're putting together a world, or you're making up a map, it's really important to try to figure out, how are these people going to find water? You know, why would their city be where it is, and where are they going to get for all the metal that they need for all their armor and their weapons? Where are they getting that from? Where are the mines in this area? Where are they getting their lumber? By kind of constantly thinking about that sort of fleshed out a lot of the starting area, and then I got to sort of build off of that. But I think that that's actually kind of important. You really have to just think about the environment that they're gonna be living in, and by doing that, everything sort of fleshes itself out in a lot of ways, and the whole setting becomes a lot more real, right? It feels more natural as things are happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, how did you know, as we mentioned, worlds are complex. So, you know, there's a lot of detail and stuff there. How did you have your players help you? How did they add to the world?
First off was really just, I gave them a rundown on what the world would be like, and then I let them choose whatever characters. In some ways, you know, I might have told them that, you know, tieflings are probably going to be rare in this area, or, you know, I gave them some guidelines on what would be unusual, you know, because I think you want to know that ahead of time. Am I going to be playing a character that's going to stand out, you know? And so once they chose their characters, we and they created their backgrounds, and they were all very good about, you know, these are all seasoned players I've played with a long time, and they all came up with some good backstories. And in doing so, they really created some of the places and some of the in a couple cases, the factions. We had a couple characters that were playing nobility, and so in that sense, it gave me reason to come up with what did the nobility look like in this town. And in doing so, you know, I let them come up with obviously let them come up with their own family and that, but then I would come up with, you know, okay, who are their enemies and who are their allies, and we really just started, you know, got very sort of Game of Thrones, where we suddenly had all these different families in this city of Princeholm where we started, and that was not something I would have immediately done if it weren't for the fact that they were playing nobles. You know, we needed to know what the nobles were like here. Yeah. I had one of my players came from a different town, and so because of that, he very much fleshed out what that town looked like. Not that he sat down and wrote it up, but just in role playing, there was often times where he got to sort of make the choice. So, you know, like he started to flesh out what that town looked like before we ever got there. Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. And I always think it's, you know, it's always useful to have your players involved with the creation. I think years ago when I first started GMing, I thought, you know, I had to create almost everything or something. And, you know, until one time, I think I was tired and I was like, well, you just tell me what it is. Sure. Yeah. And, so I always, you know, cause that's where, you know, I don't know. I hear some things online sometimes, you know, on Reddit or something where, you know, somebody will say, oh, well, you know,
I just want to show up and have my game master tell me, some of these things. And you're just like, I've never met a player like that in real life.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Because they always want to make up stuff. I mean, we're all creative. We're all trying to tell the story. That's why they're wanting to play the role playing game as well. Is they're creative as well. So, yeah. Yeah. So I don't know. I always now take advantage of that. If there's something that I don't want to think of, or I want to see somebody's different take, or if I've been making up too much stuff along the way, I'll just be like, well, what do you think? Where do what do you think is there?
Sure.
What's, what would you, you're asking me what's on the island. Well, what do you think's on the island?
Right. It's part of the beauty of the game, right? Like it's so collaborative.
Yeah.
It's so great how, I had some ideas at the beginning of, and I'm sure it's like this for every campaign, but for the podcast, I had some ideas of maybe where I might have wanted things to go, but like it really didn't matter, because as soon as the players started playing, they were going to tell us where they were going, and so that's one of the reasons that I think it was important for me, especially in a podcast, because we're kind of trying to tell a story. We want it to be entertaining for people that are listening, and so the preparation was probably above and beyond what I would do if it was just a bunch of us friends sitting around and nobody listening to us. But there were times where it was so exciting just to sort of sit back and watch what they did with this. I had this thought about what was going to happen, and it wasn't anything like I thought it was going to be, but it was so much better.
Yeah. To me, it is always more compelling when you have like the group mind, kind of coming in together with a whole bunch of, with the game master and the players just coming in all together. And I think the stories just take on, a lot of different dimensions than if the game master alone kind of just has, like a basic idea or a basic story in mind.
Sure.
Yeah.
Even if there's some conflict within the group too, I think that was actually one of the things that I really learned from this campaign in the podcast was that it was okay when there was conflict among the characters. And I don't mean the players. The players were all friends and all that, but they really got into their characters, and so there would be this conflict about what the different characters wanted to do, or they would kind of give each other trouble, and it would end up being sort of contentious every once in a while, but it was interesting. Conflict is interesting. And so it really put us in some, created some storylines that I wouldn't ever have thought to write, because I couldn't, because we needed that collaboration for that stuff to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, obviously, not players. We're not talking about players being contentious, about the characters. If you have a chaotic neutral, druid, and you have a lawful good fighter, they're not going to see eye to eye when the chaotic neutral druid is like healing your enemies, or something like that. They're just not going to see eye to eye, a lot of times. So I think sometimes we miss that. You don't have to just like attack the other, characters or anything, but you can, express different worldviews, because they're going to have different feelings about different things.
Yeah, it's cool when players are willing to really dig into those characters and let that stuff happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we mentioned that you're using the 5th edition, but obviously you've created your own world. Did you make any changes to the system or to classes or anything like that, or did you keep pretty much everything else the same?
Yeah, I made a few little changes here and there. One of the things that I did, and it's more stylistic than it is than it is like a rule changes and things. But I kind of created different races from the called half elves. We had what we called Saradin. Culturally, they weren't just half elf, half human. They were kind of their own thing. And we did the same thing with half orcs. We called them high orcs, and one of our characters, two of our characters played Saradin, one of them played a high orc. And mechanically, I didn't change anything in there, but we made it part of the culture. And so when we had Holg, Holg was the name of our rogue. He was the high orc, played by Thomas, and we would always run into really interesting role-playing moments because people would call him an orc, and in this case, he wasn't an orc. He was a high orc. He was something else, and so we really played around with kind of this perception of differences, and really honestly touched on some things that I think are very kind of profound in the from the modern view, and just looking at sort of these social justice type conflicts, and being able to look at them through sort of a fantasy lens, in which it's maybe not as it's easier to deal. That's what fantasy and science fiction does for us. Sometimes it lets us deal with sort of real world issues, but it does it in kind of a safe way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the power of narrative, right? I mean, just that we can see things in fiction that we can't see in the real world, or it has a way of spelling it out clearly to us so we can actually see it, because we're eye level into our own culture, and we need something to break us out of that.
Yeah, kind of separate from it.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm wondering, since you made this a podcast, and you kind of alluded to it a little bit about, wanting to tell a story and be entertaining instead of just, I guess just sitting around the table and quoting Monty Python or something. But,
I'm sure we did some of that.
Did some of that. Yeah. Well, you can't, you can't get away from too much of that, I guess. But how did doing a podcast affect your dynamic as the game master and then your players and them? It
definitely was. It was a great experience. It was different, I'm excited to try something else with it. I don't know that we'll do a full campaign, 3-year campaign like we did. We might chop it down into smaller parts, or I don't know, but it was really fun for me as a GM to really be careful about loose ends, because it was very important to me to finish the story. And over the course of 3 years, sometimes campaigns fizzle out, or somebody moves away or something happens, and we did it. We got to the end. We did 57 episodes, and it's a full story. And that, as the GM of that, and again, I'm not, I had lots and lots of help from my players, but it was really satisfying as in a podcast to be able to really pay attention to those loose ends, because honestly, I think that if you go back, if you listen to our podcast and you get through several episodes, you're going to see that we are going back to things that happened. There are things that end up in episode 57 that were alluded to in episode 3, or that were, that there are all these things that I'd really kept track and said, I really want to close that up. And so, and I was driven to do that because I had an audience.
Yeah.
As opposed to, well, maybe we won't ever get back to that. I really wanted to make that happen. Another thing, though, that happened was that I often felt, and I think my players sometimes felt it too, is that I sometimes was railroading them a little bit more than I would naturally, because of the fact that I felt like we needed to get to a certain point, or, I was effectively thinking about that audience again. And I don't know that that's always a good thing. I think that it was justified in some places, and I think that it worked out okay. But there are definitely, again, when I've got an audience, I'm going to treat it a little bit differently than if it's just, 6 guys sitting around the table goofing around.
Sure. No, that's just interesting to hear, because I know, the whole popularity of podcasts and actual plays and everything has just been exploding in the last few years. And so it's just, I just find it interesting to see how, that's going to maybe change the game or maybe even change the perception of new players when they approach the game. I just wonder, what that kind of effect will have on people,
Sure.
because, back in the day, right? Like I started playing in the early mid 80s, and it was just like, I had one example of how to play a role-playing game, from the game master that taught me. And then I started running games, right? So like I had one example until, maybe for like 5, 6, 7 years until somebody else I met somebody else who role played, or, it might have even been longer because everybody who started GMing, I taught them, right? Like, so, it's just interesting now that you can, and I talk about on the podcast before, it's just you go to YouTube and you can learn how to play. I had to just make it up back in the day, and I guess we all did, So I just wonder what that's kind of that effect on games is going to be if game masters and players are going to emulate, kind of what they hear on podcasts and what they hear on YouTube and stuff. And I think the net, of course, is just positive because it's the market and the audience has exploded. So, if Critical Role can have 73,000 people listen to them live on Twitch on a Thursday night, it's quite amazing. So,
sure.
Yeah.
Well, and just the idea that, seeing that, that people are listening from, France or from Iran, or you get these kind of reports on where your podcasts are being listened to, and even if it's not 73,000 people, but just the fact that somebody in the Philippines was listening to us, and that's really flattering and humbling.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, I've seen that on my podcast as well. And then even just recently, I gave some online presentations for a Gen Con online, and the people in attendance were in Norway and Spain. And, it's just like, what? That's amazing. It's just,
it is.
It's just incredible. So, and I think we're in, if not, I think we're in like a second golden age, if not the golden age for role-playing games. I think it's amazing to see all
for sure. It's become a much more mainstream and much more just socially accepted. I'm a teacher, and I've run a gaming club for this is year number 7. So, and I've seen, lots of kids come through. It's secondary kids. So it's 8th grade through 12th grade. Okay. And I'll have kids that stay with me all the way. They were with me as an 8th grader, and they show up every week until they graduate from high school. Because there's a bonding thing there, right? And some kids come and play D&D or Magic or whatever, all kinds of different games. But they find this place where they're just, it doesn't matter if in my experience anyway, it doesn't matter if they're a 12th grader or an 8th grader, because they just like playing D&D together. And that's pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. That
doesn't
awesome.
happen with a lot of other hobbies.
No, you're absolutely right. Yes, that a 14-year-old and an 18-year-old would be like caught dead together. Right?
Yeah. But but they're swinging swords at orcs together, and that's so cool. Yeah,
absolutely. So that is really good to hear. And then about your podcast too, like, 57 episodes, this huge campaign, and you're absolutely right that, so many campaigns just kind of, spin off the rails and can't get finished because of, this nasty thing called reality or whatever.
Right. Yeah. Life gets in the way.
Yeah. Life gets in the way. What levels did you guys get to? Did you go all the way from 1 to 20 or?
initially that was my plan to go to try to let's just do the whole thing and get them to 20. We ended up closing the story out at level 16.
Oh, okay.
And technically I probably would have leveled them up after that. So I guess we could say 17, but they just never quite played 17.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's awesome. Yeah. Cause I was hearing some things recently, or reading some things I should say. And it was like on Roll20, it was like most campaigns like stop before level 10 and don't reach like session 13 or something like that.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So,
and sometimes that's okay too, like it's, I think there's a lot of value in just, playing a story and finishing it and not feeling as though, we have to make it this gigantic commitment, but it's really cool when that happens for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I still remember the first time, like that our group got to finish a full campaign, and it was just like, this is what people talk about. This is the mythical thing called finishing a campaign. Right. But I could go on and on just asking you more questions, but I won't take up too much of your time. But I just find, like I said, just the whole. Obviously, I love games and I love the hobby and I love to see it growing. And so it's just fascinating to see, more and more people sharing their campaigns, and we're able to learn about people's campaigns through like your podcast and everything. So why don't you tell everybody where they can find your podcast?
Sure. You can find it wherever you find podcasts, on iTunes or Spotify, or wherever you go. Basically, we also actually have posted them on YouTube as well, so that you can kind of play them that way. We do have a website, d4onthefloor.com, and so you can certainly get to our podcast through that. And then we also include some of some supplemental things and some documents from the podcast and our map. John, our one of our players, made a couple of really beautiful maps along the way of the world that we're in, and so that's all posted on there as well, d4onthefloor.com. You can certainly follow us on Facebook and on Twitter. It's D4Floor, so at D4Floor on Twitter.
Okay, got it. And I will be sure to include those links in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So anybody who is listening right now, if you head over to dicegeeks.com, check out the show notes for this episode, you will find links to Mark's podcast and to his social media. And so you can learn more. Well, Mark, like I said, I could just keep on asking questions because I love talking about games, but, I really do appreciate you coming on today. And thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you. This has been fun.
All right, there you have it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Mark today. As I mentioned in the episode, you can find links to his podcast in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So head over there, check those out. If you want some free stuff, and I know you do, because everybody wants something for free, you should head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You'll get 10 free dungeon maps. You'll never miss an episode of this show. And each and every Friday, you'll get an email update from me letting you know what is going on in this world that I like to call Dice Geeks. All right, now, guys, I thank you so much for listening today. It is awesome to be able to come to you each and every Wednesday with some awesome interview talking about role-playing or filmmaking or stories. It is a privilege that you would take your time to listen to my show. That is awesome. I thank you so much. And until next Wednesday, keep gaming!